help as we cover another urgent search for a missing black girl. 15-year-old Sophie Reeder disappeared from Fort Lauderdale, Florida on May 20th, 2017. While no official suspects have ever been named, police and Sophie's parents fear she may have been lured away by sex traffickers. Sophie would be 19 years old now. If you've seen her or know anything about this case, please call the Black and Missing Foundation at 877-972-2634. Sex trafficking has become a major problem in our community, so we're taking a deeper dive into another tragic aspect of sex trafficking, the criminalization of these young women who are themselves victims. In cities across the country, women and girls who engage in sex work or trafficked are often targeted by police, arrested, and prosecuted. Washington Post reporter Jessica Contrera spent months looking into how that dynamic plays out in one of America's most popular tourist destinations. Her work culminated in this piece for the Post titled "Sex-Trafficked Kids Are Crime Victims. In Las Vegas, They Still Go to Jail." Jessica joins us from Washington tonight. Jessica, great seeing you again.
Good to see you too.
All right, so you joined us before to talk about Crystal Kaiser, a sex trafficking victim in Wisconsin accused of killing her alleged abuser. Your latest piece highlights the bigger picture, the system that actually treats victims of sex trafficking as criminals. Why did you decide to pursue the story and from this angle?
Yeah, I think most people understand that if an adult pays to sexually abuse a minor, that that adult has committed a crime. But what most people don't realize is that that child can also be arrested, jailed, and charged with a crime in many places across the country. And so I wanted to understand why that was still happening. If so many people are aware of sex trafficking, and aware of, that those children are victims and that they cannot consent, why were they still being arrested? And so I went to the place that, by FBI data, arrests more child sex trafficking victims than anywhere else, and that's Nevada.
You said that one of the reasons you wrote this article too was to obviously clear up the myths about how young girls can get drawn into sex trafficking. It's important, especially for parents watching tonight, to know that it's not always the way they see it on TV or movies. Can you expound?
Yeah, that's a really important point. Thank you for bringing that up. What we see in the data from interviews with children who have experienced this and adults who have experienced this as children is that most of the time, the people who become their traffickers are people who they knew and who they trusted. It might be somebody who was a friend of the family or a trusted person in their life, like a coach. It might be somebody that they met on the internet and who earned their trust by giving them the love and attention that they were looking for somewhere else. But while sometimes we think of traffickers as violent and locking people up, it's not to say that those things never happen. But what we know is that often what they're using to keep their victims close is coercion, is persuasion, is threatening, things like that, that make a lot of these victims that I talk to in Vegas and that they see there are girls who believe that they're doing the right thing for a guy that they love.
Um, so, Jessica, when you take this deeper dive into the operations of sex trafficking, who do you spend the most time with and what do you learn?
That's a really important question. And I think first and foremost, it's important for journalists to listen to the voices of the survivors, of people who have been through this. But it's also important for us to take a really hard look at the system. And so that's what I tried to do with this story. So I spent time with the police officers who arrest these victims, with the public defenders who represent them in court, the prosecutors who deal with their charges, the judges who make decisions about them, and ultimately also the advocates who try to provide them with the resources that they need. And at every step of the way in Las Vegas, people agree that this system is failing kids. They're consistently putting these victims in handcuffs, strip searching them, putting them in jail cells, and leaving them there for days and sometimes longer than a week. And that is all because they've been victimized.
You've also reported, Jessica, that Nevada arrests the most child victims of sex trafficking in the whole country. Why is that?
That's a really good question, and it's a multifaceted answer. But I think there's two things to keep in mind. A lot of police departments across the country are choosing to no longer do this. A lot of lawmakers across the country are saying you cannot do this. So in Nevada, it's still lawmakers are still allowed to arrest children. They're not allowed to charge them with solicitation, but the arrest they are still allowed to do. And the reason for that, they believe, is because the arrest is the way that they remove the child from a dangerous situation. And so when you have a place
Mm.
like Las Vegas, where there's a lot of a culture of sex for sale, despite the fact that prostitution is not legal in Las Vegas. A lot of people think that it is. And when there is a demand, traffickers work to fill that demand. And so that is why when these police officers who go out and pretend to be sex buyers and do, sort of sting operations that a lot of police departments across the country are no longer doing, they find these children. And they see the same patterns in these kids again and again.
Now, you talked to one of my producers about finding solutions and how you believe that many people working on the front lines want to help but can't necessarily agree on how. Can you tell us what you mean by that and how it can be difficult, with that balancing act?
Right. I think it's important to talk about that because these police officers are finding children who they believe are being sexually exploited and raped by adults, right? And so they want to remove the children from those situations. So the way that they're doing it is by putting them in jail because they don't have anywhere else that's a safe place for the kids to go. What the advocates come in and say is, you're creating additional harm. You're making their life worse. You're doing exactly what their trafficker told them that you would do. So you're actually making the situation worse. So they disagree on those things. But in Nevada in particular, and in Las Vegas especially, what they do agree upon is that they could create another place, an alternative to detention, where these kids could go and they could get medical attention and therapy and go to school and hang out and have a safe place to go until there is maybe a more permanent place for them to be long term. And so people in Las Vegas, advocates, judges, they've been talking about this for years. And yet the city and the state has still failed to make it a reality.
Washington Post reporter Jessica Contrera, thank you so much for your time and insight on this topic. More Making the Case when we return.